Another important shift we see is that in many ways the entire world is now moving towards the state-driven model. So even the United States is now in many ways playing Beijing's game and moving towards greater state-driven regulatory model. Now we see data localization becoming a global phenomenon that really now presents impediments for businesses that do require to move the data across the borders. And that is something that now has become more of a global trend when the United States no longer anymore endorses the values around the market-driven model. The countries are more skeptical and thereby much more focused on whether they control the technologies. They don't want to have those dependencies. They don't want to have those vulnerabilities. But that means they are unraveling.
皆さんこんにちは、山口です。私たちはより良いデジタル社会とか AI 社会を作っていくために何が必要かを考えております。私どもの会社は Writing the Way to a Brighter Society ということで何が将来に向けて必要かを考えているところでございます。その中で規制、レギュレーションというのは大変重要な要素であろうと思いまして、今回コロンビア大学のブラッドフォード教授をお招きして議論させていただきました。でこの規制のところで重要なのは規制とイノベーションの関係で、ブラッドフォード先生も言ってますけども、規制が強ければイノベーションを阻害するというのはこれは間違いであって、規制にもいろんないい規制悪い規制があって中身をきちっと議論していかないかんということを言ってたかと思います。それで今回このお願いしたブラッドフォード教授について少し紹介させていただきます。ブラッド教授は2020年にはですね、ブリュッセルエフェクトということでこの書籍を書かれております。これは EU が環境とか食品とか、デジタルでもおいてもそうですが、規制を多く設定してグローバル経済にいろんな影響を与えていると。でこの規制を策定している力のメカニズムとか世界へのビジネスインパクトはどういうものかということを解明されたのがこのブリュッセルエフェクトという本でございます。2023年にはデジタルエンパイア図ということでこの本でございますけれども、世界のデジタル規制については3つのパターンがあるということで、一つはヨーロッパを中心にライトドリブンということで人権を守ることを中心としたレギュレーションが一つのパターンで、2つ目のパターンはアメリカに代表されるようにイノベーションをできるだけ阻害しないようなイノベーションを考えるということでマーケットドリブンのレギュレーションで、3番目は中国で代表されますように国家の安定を重視するということでステートドリブンのレギュレーションということで、こういうレギュレーションが国家間での競争にもなり、また国家とビッグテックというようなこのプレイヤーとの間でもいろんな争いが起きているというようなお話を書かれております。で今回のメインのところで議論させていただきたかったのは規制とイノベーションの関係ということで、より分かりやすく言うと、規制が強いヨーロッパではビッグテックが生まれてこない、育たないということを俗説として言われてるんですけれども、このブラッドフォード教授はそうではないということで、時代の話もされてましたけど、2010年以降にレギュレーションは厳しくなったんだけど、ビッグデータが出たのは1990の後半であるというような話があったかと思います。で EU でなぜビッグデックが出てこなかったということの分析の中で、やはり私どもこれはEU に限らずイノベーションが起きるための条件の要素であると思いますけれども、一つはこのデジタルというのは規模の経済が効きますから、分断化されたマーケットではなくて大きなマーケットが必要であると。ヨーロッパはそれがフラグメンティッドなマーケットであったということを言ってたかと思います。2番目は資金調達がダイナミックにできるということで、銀行依存だけでなくいろんなところが調達、ベンチャーキャピタル等から資金調達できるということもイノベーションには必要なんだと。で3つ目は事業に失敗した時にまたチャレンジできるような 風土であったり法律になっているかどうかというところも重要だということを言っていたと思います。で4番目がタレントということで、タレントというか人材ですね。人材が本当にいろんなテクノロジーを持った人材、またクリエイティブなアイデアを持った人材が集まる、または引きつけるような大学のシステムとか研究機関になっているかどうかというようなことが必要だということを言ってたかと思います。で今回のインタビューはこのブラッドフォード教授は2023年24年ぐらいの状況で今まで本を書かれているんですけれども、この2025年になって大きく社会が変わったと、この変わっていることについてどのようにお考えなのかということをインタビューしたのが特にですね、今回のインタビューのポイントであると私どもは考えております。ということで、実際にですねインタビューしたところを見ていただければと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。Today, I will be asking Professor Anne Bradford how regulation, especially across the EU and the US, can protect rights while enabling innovation in the Gen AI era. Our goal today is to outline what a good rulebook looks like, one that makes digital markets easy, safer, and AI adoption more trustworthy. We will first map how the EU, US, and China are shaping the field, then test whether protecting privacy, safety, and fairness actually slows innovation or strengthens it. I'm Shigeki Yamaguchi. In the past year, we have translated and brought latest digital transformation framework to Japan. This is my pleasure to be the host and interview Professor Anne Bradford. I had the pleasure of meeting Bradford in New York this May, and we are honored to welcome her. Professor Bradford, could you briefly introduce yourself and the perspective you will bring to our discussion? Please.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me here for this conversation. My name is Anu Bradford. I'm professor at Columbia Law School, originally from Finland, but today live and work and do research in New York City. The focus of my research is mainly on digital regulation and the global economy. And I have written books called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, and Digital Empires, Global Battle to Regulate Technology. So I'm very interested in different approaches, different jurisdictions take into digital regulation, including artificial intelligence, data privacy, content moderation, and so forth. But I'm also very interested in whether digital regulation impedes or can it even enhance innovation. So I think we will have a chance to discuss some of those topics today.
Thank you. Please allow me to share our view about the current social situation. Data is a building block. Three shifts define the new paradigm. Digital has slashed search, coordination, and transaction costs. Value is migrating to a connected intangible economy with direct digital delivery. And generative AI is a connective accelerator, creating and adapting content in real time. Today, we sit in a blended phase, but Gen AI is steepening the move toward connected intangible, which reshapes competition and sets up the dynamics we will examine next. Building on that shift, let me map the causal loop we see. For economy aspect, customers pay for personalization and 24/7 access, and producers use data and Gen AI to deliver at very low cost, giving a few big platforms an edge. Politicians reach voters cheaply online and simple messages spread fast, while voters get targeted news in real time, including AI-made of fake information. This is happening in political world. People have limited attention, so we choose short, familiar, personalized content. Creators can now make and copy content almost for free with Gen AI. So channels flood with tailored posts. Feeds reinforce our tastes and ultimately shaping the culture. More use yield to more data, yield to better models, and yield to even more personal content. In this next section, we will explore how different countries and regions are building very different models of digital regulation. Now, let's look more closely at how digital regulation is evolving in practice. As Professor Bradford outlines in Digital Empires, US market-driven is platforms move fast and regulators step in after problems. China state-driven is tight central control, data kept at home, platforms aligned with national goals. And EU rights-driven is privacy, fairness, and competition duties set in law upfront. Bradford, could you help us understand how these three models emerged and why these reflect such different assumptions about the role of technology in society?
Yes, so all these three jurisdictions have a very different understanding on the appropriate role and relationship between the state, the market, and the individual. Americans have always been very trusting of the market. The American philosophy is that we want to maximize free market, free internet, incentives to innovate. Free speech is very central. And there's a lot of skepticism of government intervention. So that has led the Americans to adopt the kind of market-driven regulatory model where the regulation is really vested with the companies themselves, and the government is only exercising a very marginal role. This is very different from the European Union, where there has always been greater trust in state intervention in a way that makes outcomes better for the citizens in the society. There has been much more skepticism of the market's ability to create a fair and sustainable transformation, including digital transformation. So the Europeans have always felt the need to protect the fundamental rights of individuals with state intervention. And partially this is because there's no trust that technology companies themselves would act in public interest. But there are also historical reasons why the Europeans, for instance, find that data privacy is so central. Europeans still remember the surveillance in Eastern Europe, including in Germany, in Eastern Germany, that really invaded the privacy of the individuals. The Europeans also remember how the Nazis were able to obtain the information of Jews by infringing their data privacy. So there are historical, there are cultural reasons that explain these differences. China, on the other hand, is a different political system. China is not a democracy. China has an authoritarian government that really prioritizes maintaining social stability in the country. And for that reason alone, the state needs to assume a strong role in the economy, including, very importantly, in the digital economy. And that explains why China then uses technology not only to build its own technological capabilities, but also as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda.
Thank you. Since the publication of Digital Empires in 2023, how would you describe the current positioning of the three regulatory models: market-driven, rights-driven, and state-driven?
So this is a really interesting question because in many ways, in just 2 years, so much has happened in the world. So a couple of changes that I observed. When I published the book, it really seemed like the rights-driven model was gaining victory, especially in the democratic world. The countries were coalescing behind a variation of the European Union's rights-driven model, especially in techno-democracies around the world, adopting variations of what the EU was endorsing. Even the United States seemed to have lost its confidence in the market's ability to deliver optimal outcomes. There was less trust in the tech companies. The Biden administration was eager to impose regulations, including on artificial intelligence. But a lot has changed since President Trump was re-elected. And now the United States seem to be in many ways doubling down on the market-driven regulation, with the White House, the Trump administration, having very close relationship with the tech companies. So there is a lot of pursuit of deregulation, where the companies are really seen as capable of self-regulating. There are some exceptions to that. There are still antitrust investigations that the US government is pursuing against the tech companies. So it's not that no regulation is taking place. And also individual states like California is still regulating. But we certainly see a remarkable shift where the US and the EU are diverging in even more fundamental ways. Another important shift we see is that in many ways, the entire world is now moving towards the state-driven model. Digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy has become a key goal for many jurisdictions because of the geopolitical tensions and the lack of trust in relying foreign technologies. So the US-China trade and tech war is really now having global implications, where the supply chains that used to be global, including in technology, are giving way to create a decoupling of the digital economy. We see countries imposing export controls and investment restriction, having the state very strongly subsidizing key technologies, including obviously then the production of chips. So even the United States is now in many ways playing Beijing's game and moving towards greater state-driven regulatory model. And the Europeans feel like they need to de-risk from Chinese technology, but also increasingly from American technology, which also leads the Europeans to balance this rights-driven model with a variation or some elements of the state-driven model.
Thank you. Now that we have seen the structural models, let's look a little deeper at the values behind each one. This slide highlights what each of the three regulatory empires is ultimately trying to protect. These are not just different policy designs. They are different world views about what technology is for and who it should serve. Could you help us understand what these core values reveal about how each region sees the role of technology in society?
So in many ways, the core value for the European Union is the protection of digital rights of individuals. The idea is that we need to ensure that the fundamental rights of individuals are protected. These include the fundamental right to privacy, but also the protection of the democratic structures of the society. personal autonomy, self-determination, personal dignity. Those are really important European values. And that requires, in the eyes of the Europeans, for the state to be a proactive rule setter and actually enter into the digital space in the ways that guarantees those fundamental rights. So it also means then that the Europeans are more precautionary when it comes to issues like artificial intelligence. Even if we cannot be certain that certain risks will materialize, the Europeans are proactively ex ante regulating the AI space so as to keep the individual safe. The Americans are very focused on innovation. It's a very techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of approaching the digital transformation. It means that we want to empower these tech entrepreneurs to bring about this positive change that technology can unleash. Also, a very important American value is free speech. And there is this sense that these technology platforms provide important avenues for democratic discourse, but generally for free speech to shape the societies. That requires the government really to take a back seat. The government does not intervene, and we rather let the markets to develop these relationships. So it is a market-first principle, first and foremost. China, because of the country's different political model, really values social stability as a fundamental goal for the Chinese Communist Party. It means that technological sovereignty for China and China's international role in this space is also important in order then to protect Chinese values within China, but also exporting those values to other parts of the world. But China is very comfortable with a strong state role. So the state here, the party state, is a centralized enforcer that then intervenes through censorship in order to curate the kind of information environment that is consistent with the political ideology and political goals of the state. So the Chinese environment in this space is much more state control and much more restricted. And even though there is an encouragement of private entrepreneurship, their freedom needs to be reconciled with these important political imperatives of the Chinese state.
Thank you for sharing. Have there been any notable shifts in the attitude of governments, tech giants, or public opinion toward digital regulation?
So I would say that there has been less of a shift in the last few years among the public opinion. So in many ways, the individual citizens around the world maintain that we need to regulate the technology space. That has become more pronounced with various scandals involving tech companies where the individuals have lost their trust in tech companies' ability to self-regulate. AI is something where individuals are excited but are also concerned about risks if the technology remains unregulated. But where we really see until a few years ago, the tech companies seem to be more willing to comply with government regulation. There was the sense that regulation was inevitable and they had no choice but to adhere to, for instance, the extensive regulations coming out of the European Union. But now I observe a rather fundamental shift where the tech companies feel that they are more empowered in today's political environment to push back on those regulations. So tech companies have aligned themselves, many of them, with President Trump and his administration, and are now collectively, with the help of the president, basically exerting greater pressure on the Europeans to deregulate and rein in some of those regulatory tendencies. So the tech companies feel more empowered. And the big question is whether the governments are going to respond to this shift. And here I would invite you to really focus on what is happening in Europe, because the European Union has been a very committed regulator in this space, very confident regulator in this space. But now the Europeans are feeling vulnerable because they are feeling the threats of the Trump administration that is now telling the Europeans that if you continue to enforce your digital regulations against our tech giants, those laws are unfair, those are discriminatory, and they will have consequences. So the Europeans are now worried that this digital agenda gets politicized and may lead to tariffs as part of the trade war that now provides the context for all regulatory policies. So the Europeans are certainly feeling the pressure to continue to regulate the same way.
Here is how the three models collide in practice. At two levels, country versus country, and government versus foreign or private tech firms operating inside their borders. Could you walk us through how these cross-border regulatory conflicts are unfolding, especially how governments are using regulation as a geopolitical tool? Please.
So right now, the context for all of this is this tech and trade war that is only intensifying. There is very little trust among tools for not just technological power, but economic and also geopolitical and potentially one day even military power. So what we now see is that countries are racing to develop their own technological capabilities while trying to limit their rivals' access to these same technologies. So the US-China tech war that has been going on for some years is only intensifying. So we see even more export controls. We see the US government very actively managing the business conduct of the US tech companies in China. But China is also responding with the same way. So we see this movement towards decoupling, but at the same time, we realize how integrated the global digital economy is and how difficult it is to fully decouple that economy. So we see these horizontal conflicts between China and the US intensify and continue, but we see this escalation alternate with some forms of de-escalation because the US tech companies still need access to the Chinese market. And the Chinese government cannot fully say that it is going to produce all its chips and it would never need access to American technology. The horizontal conflict between the European Union and the United States also continues, but it now has a different level of intensity. Because right now, the United States, as I mentioned, the combination of the government and tech companies are contesting the European regulatory agenda. So we see a more political, more intense pressure to try to change the underlying dynamics of this particular horizontal conflict. So we certainly see more of a national security driven, the more of a regulatory conflict that is taking place in the context of a very different global economy where trade wars and protectionism and industrial policy is now a norm. And that also is shaping now the conflicts between the US and the EU.
Thank you. Digital Empire, your book emphasizes that EU and US will collaborate smoothly against China. However, President Donald Trump changed this situation and scenario. What is your aspect on US digital regulation?
So this is absolutely right. The end of the Biden administration was that the United States really wanted to lead a coalition of techno-democracies to challenge the rise of Chinese digital authoritarianism. So the idea was that this collaboration builds on a close cooperation between the United States and Europe, but also in close collaboration with Japan and South Korea, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, other so-called techno-democracies that are committed to the protection of liberal democracy as a foundation for digital society. But now the President Trump's and his administration policies are really pulling the US away from any kind of value-based international collaboration. And a wide rift is now emerging between the United States and the European Union. So the US has launched a trade war, not just against adversaries like China, but also against the country's traditional allies, including Japan and Europe and Canada and so forth. So that has made it much harder to now pursue this kind of collaboration among techno democracies. So the United States is really now much more America first, interest driven, and less willing to find a way to collaborate. And one consequence is that in many ways, the fear is that when the US steps away from international collaboration, the question is whether many countries will deepen their collaboration with China, and whether the winner here is the Chinese model, because China has expressed its interest to continue to collaborate with the rest of the world.
Thank you. In recent years, we have seen a rising number of governments require that data generated within their borders be stored and processed locally. This trend is driven by multiple concerns: national security, privacy protection, and digital sovereignty. You have written about how regulatory divergence is driving data localization. Could you help us understand the forces behind this shift and how it affects business operating across borders?
So this is a really important development. So as part of the American market-driven model, the United States was also the champion of always a free movement of data across the borders. The United States wanted to have a WTO, so the World Trade Organization, basically also enforce the free movement of e-commerce, the data as part of the digital trade that was taking place. And the concern was that it is more the authoritarian countries that are restricting the movement of data outside of their countries. But now we see data localization becoming a global phenomenon that really now presents impediments for businesses that do require to move the data across the borders. So what is driving this shift? And I would say it is really twofold. So one is the concern for national security, and the idea that this data can be a national security asset, and hence the country can be vulnerable if it lets a confidential data or sensitive data or otherwise just important data to leave the borders of the jurisdiction. But there's also a privacy, more fundamental rights concern. This has been traditionally the concern of the Europeans. Europeans have not wanted the European protected data to be transferred to any jurisdiction where the data protection couldn't be guaranteed. So there has been a long-standing battle between the United States and the European Union, for instance, where the Europeans don't trust what happens to the European data once it is in the hands of the Americans. Will the national security agencies have access to that data? Americans don't provide as strong privacy protections, hence the concern. So now this dual concern for data privacy, but also the concern for national security, is now giving two reasons for the governments to basically set various barriers and restrict the movement of data. And we see examples where the companies are really struggling to navigate this. So you have companies that, for instance, now are requested to submit some data as part of the law enforcement investigation in the United States, but let's say that data is located in Europe and protecting by European privacy laws, which prevent these companies at the same time with complying with the data request of their own government, the United States, and that of the governments where the data is hosted, mainly in the European Union. So many of the companies are in these intractable positions whereby they cannot comply with all the regulators at the same time. The companies really want to endorse a greater movement for data. That's important for the cross-border business collaboration, and that is extremely disruptive for them if there is uncertainty as to when and how they can transfer that data across the global marketplace.
Thank you. Zooming in on the daily pain point, US-EU data transfers remain fragile. After Privacy Shield was struck down, firms rely on SCCs as add-ons and on the 2023 data privacy framework. Yet the same processing can be judged differently across jurisdictions and creating costly asymmetries where small and medium-sized enterprises avoid the EU and big players face large fines. Bradford-san, would you say that the United States is moving away from a market-driven model and rather closer to a state-driven model? For example, sweeping tariff measures and direct government investment in private companies, intensified immigration enforcement.
So absolutely. This was a really interesting example on data transfers where the United States was a big proponent of the freedom to move data, but then since has changed its position globally. But the United States is now also one of the leading jurisdictions to pursue what I call digital protectionism or techno-nationalism, whereby the government is imposing very strict export controls, is restricting investment into critical infrastructures, networks in the United States, for instance, and even making government investments in leading companies, which really shows an unprecedented level of government involvement through investments, through subsidies, through various market restrictions. This is not the market-driven model. And that is something that now has become more of a global trend when the United States no longer anymore endorses the values around the market-driven model. So that will elevate tensions when the other countries no longer trust the United States' willingness to engage with these countries globally. That pushes many other countries also to adopt export controls, investment restriction, viewed technological sovereignty as a key goal for the country. So now we see a global movement towards a state-driven model. And this is very much, I think, the trend that is now a prevalent trend and will likely continue as long as the geopolitical tensions will continue.
Thank you. Do you view the current administration's policies as a temporary shift, or do you believe they signal a longer-term pivot in the U.S. regulatory model and or government involvement?
So I think this is a really good question and something that many of us today in the United States are asking, because we are watching the country change quite dramatically. And the question is whether this is something that is temporary or whether it's something more fundamental and more long-lasting. I am afraid that there is no going back to the world of liberal international order where the countries were trading across the borders. That really was an era where there was tremendous trust among the countries, where the international relations were smoother because there was a commitment to international institutions. Those institutions were stronger. Now the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and the others are really struggling to remain relevant. And we have deep geopolitical tensions around the world. We have war in Europe with assertive Russia. We have wars in the Middle East, in Africa, and deep tensions around South China Sea, which means that this kind of national security lens through which technology is viewed is here to stay. And in many ways, because technology has become so critical for national security, including artificial intelligence, is also now a very critical for modern warfare. The countries are more skeptical and thereby much more focused on whether they control the technologies. They don't want to have those dependencies. They don't want to have those vulnerabilities. But that means they are unraveling some of the global efficient supply chains that really relied on the idea of open marketplace. We also see a retreat from principles around liberal democracy. So we see a greater influence for authoritarian ideas, authoritarian governments, and weakening commitment to democratic institutions within democracies. So those are some of the trends that I'm afraid will not be reversed anytime soon. The question is whether we will see an end to escalation in tensions and some kind of an age of what some people have called unpeace, meaning we do not see a escalation towards military conflict, even if we still see the kind of moment where there's not true peace, not true commitment to international collaboration, and not really the world where we see the governments trust each other again the way they used to.